Guess what you get to do? Did you say practice using your knowledge of conversion, obversion, and contraposition to evaluate arguments for validity? Exactly right. All right, so here you have an argument. Some organ transplants are not sensible operations, so some organ transplants are senseless operations. Okay, so you've got your 6 steps here. Hopefully you wrote them down. But in case you didn't, here they are, my gift to you for this task I'm setting for you. So what I want you to do is follow each step and determine whether or not this argument is valid or invalid. And I want you to be able to identify either the operation that proves it's valid or the fallacy that proves it's invalid. Okay, so you're going to stop your video. You're going to work through these 6 steps, and you're really going to do it because this is the best way to learn in this course. No question about it. When you've got your 6 steps completed, then you're going to restart your video and we'll look to see how you did. All right. So let's look to see how you did here. All right, so this argument, we were again gifted with a conclusion indicator. Okay, so we've got a nice indicator word here. So that tells us that the sentence that follows it is our conclusion, and the sentence that is preceding it is our premise. So we take the step of translating both of these statements into standard form, which is pretty easy for this one because they're already in standard form. But we go ahead and organize it formally with our premise on top of the conclusion, separated with this inference bar that's sort of doing the work of a word like therefore, so, consequently, or hence. Okay. Now we're going to reduce this down to terms, but again, we're stuck with this problem like we were in an earlier example where we have more than 2 terms. Okay, we have organ transplants, sensible operations, and senseless operations. Now, in this case, sensible operations and senseless operations, I don't know that either one of those is more specific than the other. They seem to be equally specific, but I think it's wisest to choose the term that's going to be the easiest to track as I symbolize the argument. And what I mean by that is this, is that I'm going to have to reference sensible operations, okay? If I use L, senseless operations, as my term, then in order to say sensible operations, I'm going to have to say non-L or non-senseless operations, which is kind of weird and counterintuitive. It's more intuitive to say non-O when I want to say senseless operations, non-sensible operations. So I'm going to choose T and O. Again, you can choose any terms you want. I'm just choosing the ones that I think are going to be the easiest to work with. So we're going to choose T and O as our terms. You may have selected different letters. That's cool. But you should have an argument that symbolizes something like this, where you've got your premise statement, some T are not O, and your conclusion, some T are non-O, okay? Or non-whatever your predicate term was in your premise. All right, so now what I have to do is I have to identify the differences I see in these 2 statements, the premise and the conclusion. Right off the bat, I see they have different qualities. The premise is a negative statement. Some are not. That's an O statement. But the conclusion is an I statement, and that's affirmative. So one thing I notice here is that the premise and the conclusion have different qualities. I also notice that the predicates are term complements of one another. Okay, so O and non-O. So now what I have to do is identify what operation or combinations of operations, and there's no combination yet because we haven't gotten that complicated, what operation is at work here that could be applied to the premise statement to generate the conclusion statement. Is it conversion? No. Conversion is when we switch the position of the subject and predicates. Therefore, it's not contraposition either, because the subject and predicate would also be switched. But obversion requires that we change the quality, but not the quantity, and we replace the predicate with the term complement. And so if we applied obversion to this premise statement, we would get the conclusion statement. Okay, so obversion is at work here. Now the last question is, have the 2 steps of obversion been applied correctly? And the answer is yes. And so the next question is, all right, is the premise statement the kind of statement obversion can be applied to generate a statement that has the exact same truth value? And the answer is obversion can be applied to any standard form categorical statement. So yes, we can obvert that premise, and when we do, we get the conclusion, and the conclusion will have the exact same truth value. The conclusion statement that we generate through obversion will have the exact same truth value as the original statement. So if we assume the premise is true, the conclusion would have to be true, and that tells us this argument is valid by obversion. How'd you do?